Within arguably the best theme park in the world was an attraction that held a surprising comparison to the infamous extraterrestrial alien encounter, an attraction at Walt Disney World which was way too scary to share a home with rides such as Peter Pan's Flight and It's a Small World. Whilst this other attraction at Tokyo Disney Sea was nowhere near as scary, both maintained a gritty realism within their experiences, broke boundaries with original concepts and ideas, were poorly marketed to guests, and have since been replaced with cutesy Disney characters. But the difference is that not many people have heard of Storm Rider. I'm lucky enough to have experienced this now defunct attraction, an experience which surprised me during my trip to Tokyo Disney Sea in 2015. As a whole, it was a simulator on steroids, the next evolution of attractions such as Star Tours. But was it a worthy successor? Let's take you into the storm of the century as we explore Storm Rider, the regrettably defunct attraction at Tokyo Disney Sea right now. Opening with the theme park on September 4th, 2001, Storm Rider was nestled at the back of Port Discovery, and whose show building made up much of the vista of the land. With copper roofs and mechanical oddities, the building was known as the Center for Weather Control and was themed to a futuristic early 20th century laboratory that blended perfectly with the other copper and brass structures around the land. Perhaps too perfectly. Port Discovery is basically the Tomorrowland of Tokyo Disney Sea, even including an attraction called Aquatopia. But unlike most Tomorrowlands, it was and still is rather small, with Storm Rider being the only other ride in the land. Whilst the building gave off what could only be described as scientific noises, it unfortunately blended too well, and it wasn't entirely obvious that it was a feature attraction of the land. But once you waited in a brief outdoor queue, you were welcomed into the structure where your journey began. Inside continued the theme of retrofuturism with Jules Verne-inspired architecture and objects. At the back of the room was a giant radar which introduced a fierce incoming storm, and in the center sat a model of a strange device. Once guests were ushered into position, the pre-show would begin. A cast member would climb up onto the center catwalk and begin explaining the mission of Storm Rider. They introduced the ferocity of storms and stated that the storm of the century was heading straight for Port Discovery. Thankfully, their research at the center provided them with a new piece of technology called a fuse, the strange model in the center of the room, which when activated in the eye of the storm would dissipate it, saving the area. This technology is transported on specially designed vehicles called Storm Riders, which allow you to withstand the sheer intensity of the storms. With alarms blaring, music swelling, and the stakes rising, guests are ushered to line up in rows ready to board their own Storm Riders. This pre-show is performed in an atrium at the center of the structure that houses Storm Rider as an attraction, and is flanked on its sides by 2 rows of doors that lead to the ride platforms themselves. This unique layout means that whilst the ride is in motion, the pre-show can be performed to get guests ready for their experience. From above, you can distinctly see the simple layout of this building, which features the central atrium and the 2 ride platforms parallel to each other on the side that are rather large. Unlike Star Tours, which only allows for 40 riders per vehicle, Storm Rider could accommodate 122 riders per platform, which makes it over 3 times the size of the Star Tour vehicles. Finally, the doors open to the Storm Riders, and guests are ushered in and take a seat. Similar to the rest of Port Discovery, the interior of Storm Rider is filled with circular portholes, brass and copper accents, with Victorian-inspired architecture. Once all guests are seated, secured, and checked, your Storm Rider is ready to depart. The ride begins with a large protective windshield cover opening at the front of the vehicle, revealing to guests that they are now hovering outside the hangar, awaiting clearance to take off behind another Storm Rider vehicle. This also reveals that the portholes flanking the guests are actually screens, which combined with clever lighting helps to sell the illusion that you're hovering in the sky. Clearance is given to the Stormrider crafts, and now your flight is underway. You depart from Port Discovery after almost crashing into several boats, a strange act of intimidation from the vehicle's pilot, until you come upon Hydra 7, a floating city in the path of this intense storm, but you quickly ascend above it and into the storm itself. Whilst the projections featured within Stormrider are not 3D, the screens combined with the platform's intense movements provides for a rather immersive and convincing experience, but it's yet to utilize some of the attraction's biggest strengths. Shortly after entering the storm, things begin to go wrong. The other Stormrider vehicle is struck by lightning and sustains damage, forcing it to retreat and leaving you with the sole task of stopping the storm. Once you clear the outer rim of the storm and enter the eye, it's clear just how huge it is, but you need to go deeper to deploy the fuse and begin to plunge further inside. Darkness fills the cabin, whilst the winds pick up, bombarding the hull of the vehicle with debris and hail whilst being surrounded by ominous flashes of lightning. Thankfully, you're now ready to deploy the fuse to stop the storm. Lights flash within the Stormrider, preparing it as it rockets out of the vehicle from just above the windshield. But suddenly, it's struck by lightning, forcing it off track as it starts hurling towards the craft, and in what is arguably the most exciting part of the attraction, the fuse pierces the hull of the Stormrider and flies into the room with the guests whilst ominously counting down. This effect is just as simple as it is effective. Above the guest is what looks like a large tube. It's split into smaller segments along the roof, and the segment closest to the windshield actually spins. In its default position, the tube looks like a complete object, but when it spins, it reveals a large crack which allows the fuse to push on through. Considering that the hull has now been breached, the attraction simulates the damage done to the vehicle by blasting air from hidden fans onto the gas, combined with the random spraying of water to mimic rain. After being jostled about, the fuse begins to dislodge and scrapes out of the vehicle. But that's the least of your problems, as the fuse promptly explodes, causing even further damage, which is simulated through flickering around the vehicle with strobe lights, fiber optic effects, and the violent shaking of the cabin. This explosion pushes the Stormrider down towards the ocean and back near Hydra 7, where it's struggling to stay in the air. Soaring past boats, dockyards, and buildings, the Stormrider ends up on a head-on collision with one of the city's walls, but at the last moment manages to gain some height and clears the object. It's then revealed that the storm has begun to disappear. Whether out of luck or from the fuse, we're not too sure, but the celebration is short-lived as the Stormrider begins plunging down to the ocean and right near the other Stormrider vehicle that was knocked out of the sky earlier. With a near miss, the vehicle plunges into the water, and as the Stormrider begins to stabilize, the windshield starts closing to indicate that your thrilling adventure is now over. Sparks and flashing continue about the cabin as the cabin lights come on, and the damage is far more evident. But that's not the guest problem, as they're ushered out of the vehicle and back into Tokyo DisneySea. On May 17th, 2016, Stormrider set out on its final journey. The attraction had unfortunately run its course and was due to be replaced with a Finding Nemo experience which would retrofit much of the ride's existing technology. It was an unfortunate decision, but one that needed to be made. During my visit to Tokyo DisneySea, whilst most of the park was experiencing waits above 1 hour, Stormrider barely had any lines at all. Lacking a distinct and eye-catching weenie meant that the attraction blended in just far too much, and without an IP to get guests through the door, it was necessary to change the theme. Experiencing both iterations of the attraction, I can safely say that Stormrider was the better experience. Searider plays it too safe, and whilst it's obvious that the attraction is catering to children, something that DisneySea was lacking, you end up leaving the attraction with a feeling of, that's it? Watching videos of Storm Rider, you might wonder why anybody would like this attraction to begin with, but it was the combination of a carefully paced story, subtle 4D effects, surprising thrilling elements all on a large moving platform that really gave this attraction its edge. Perhaps it's the fact that the ride gave almost no expectations, but I found myself really enjoying this attraction, and it added to the Disney Sea experience as a whole. If you had experienced Storm Rider, what were your thoughts of this attraction? Or if you didn't experience it, does it look any good? For the home of all things theme parks, I'm Dominic from Review Time. Thanks for watching.